Welcome. You are starting to watch the next set of 3 videos. This is our week 12 lecture and video 1. What you can anticipate for this week's lecture series is we're going to be focusing on laws and policies that help to support management of different types of organisms in the environment. I have broken down the lecture slides into 3 different videos. The first one, first segment that we're going to be looking at is looking at management of fish, and we're going to focus in on recreational fishing. So hopefully that's of interest to those of you who are into ice fishing or fishing during the summer. The second video will focus on pollinator health. Pollinator health has been a big subject in the media, and Ontario has created a strategy to help support pollinator health in Ontario. So we'll have a look at the legislation, but also some additional policy documents that help to support that. The third video, we'll be looking at biodiversity in Ontario and looking at the approaches that we've been taking. This is a great example of partnership in order to create some policy that moves into action. And it will be focused on what are Ontario's overall objectives. So we'll focus first on looking at Fisheries Act, and so that's what the remainder of this video will be focusing on. We're going to be looking at 2 key pieces of legislation, one piece of legislation and its related regulation, and then we're also going to look at a policy document that helps to support implementation of these things. So what you're seeing on this slide, we're going to start at the federal level. So if you remember, think back to our early classes where we looked at the Constitution and the roles and responsibilities that were given to multiple levels of government. It's our federal government, the Canadian government, who has responsibility for managing fish and fish habitat. And so we're going to be looking at the Fisheries Act, which is the legislation. So when you look at the purpose of the Fisheries Act, it is providing that broad framework. It helps to establish how we are managing Canadian fisheries and how we are protecting those fisheries, but also their habitat. It looks at some of the ways in which we can regulate activities, so fishing zones, and looking at how we share waters with other countries, and it looks at our inland waters within Canada and how we can be looking at supporting collective management across the entire country. When you look at the Federal Fisheries Act, one thing it does include is it says that it supersedes provincial legislation. And so I want to just focus on that language a little bit. When you see that term, supersedes, what I want you to think about is that this essentially trumps or overrules provincial legislation that may also be looking at protecting certain fish species. And so we'll see how the flexibility that is given within the Federal Fisheries Act and the regulations under it to each of the provinces and how they undertake fish management at the local level. So the Fisheries Act provides the broad framework. We're then going to have a look at the regulation that's specific to Ontario. So that's the next component on this slide. And when you see that title of the regulation, what I want you to understand that although it has Ontario in the title, this is a federal regulation. All right, so the Canadian government has created separate regulations for each of the provinces that fall under the Federal Fisheries Act and helps to support management at that provincial level. What you will see included in the Ontario Fisheries Regulation is that it focuses on multiple types of activities. So it certainly does touch on the recreational side, which we are going to focus on, but you should also be aware that it also helps to support commercial fishing where we are selling fish as part of our domestic activities, and helps to support how we allocate those fish resources fairly across all of the country. I will provide some context on the Ontario policy that helps to support implementation of these, of the legislation and the regulations, but I just wanted to quickly show you, and you can follow along on your computers as well, is looking at how we access these federal laws. So remember that in order to access federal legislation, we are going into the Justice Laws website. And so you can see that I've included that website as part of the lecture slides. In order to find the Federal Fisheries Act, we go into Consolidated Acts. And then we're looking for Fisheries Act. So either you can search for it in the title, or you can go to the alphabetical listing, and then you can be scrolling down in order to find the Fisheries Act. Okay, and so when you get to the Fisheries Act, what I want you to see is that you can look at that specific legislation and notice that there are also the regulations that are accessible when you click on the side and that yellow R. Okay, so we're going to go back to looking at the legislation and the regulation from the federal government in a second. I'll just also wanted to skip ahead and have a look on how each of the provinces is then using that federal framework in order to support management at the local level. And so what I really want you to understand as part of this lecture is that there is a connection and a relationship in how the federal and provincial governments are working together in order to manage our fish populations. And so what you're seeing on the screen, this is the most current provincial document that helps to support implementation of the federal fisheries regulation. Okay, so each year, our provincial government in Ontario develops this guidance document. So think about the hierarchy of legislation and where that guidance document would fall in terms of how we as the public may be using it. These documents are created by, so in Ontario, it is developed by the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, and they are summarizing how locally we are actually going about implementing the federal government's requirements under the legislation and the regulation. The federal government's ability to do this is, so they are given those powers, they are authorized to do that through what we call a variation order. So again, that's an important term to remember, that when we look at the relationship between federal and provincial governments, that we can be providing some of that power and authority over to another implementer through a variation order. And so it's the Governor General, and that we create some administrative paperwork in order to indicate that we are allowing the provincial governments to adjust and refine the intent of the federal legislation and regulations in order to meet the local management requirements within their jurisdictions. Okay, so we are going to dive into have a look at the federal regulation first. And so I've included on the next slide that you can hyperlink directly into the Ontario Fisheries Regulation document. What I'm just going to show you is that when you are if you go through the Justice Laws website and you are clicking and looking at the regulations related to the Fisheries Act at the federal level, what I do want you to notice is that each of the provinces, and so I'm just going to scroll through and highlight each of those, that you'll see each of the province has their own regulations related to fisheries. And so I have included for you the PDF document. And so I do recommend using the PDF document. I find if you're scrolling through the website, it's a little bit harder to use. And so based on the questions that you're going to have for the assignment and looking at some of the questions I've included in the lecture slides, my suggestion is do use the PDF document. It is the most current document. I downloaded it recently for you. And this will give you an opportunity. It's a much cleaner read if you do that. One thing to notice, because this is a federal document, so Government of Canada, we do produce that document in both official languages. So you will see the left-hand side is in English, and then the right-hand side is in French. So just as you navigate through the document, keep that in mind. So we are going to review a few of the key sections within the federal regulation, and it's to help show you some of the structure that we are creating at the countrywide level in order to support provinces and how they are then implementing. So I have highlighted on this slide some of the key sections that we're going to be looking at. We're then going to go in and look at the Ontario summary document, and so this is provincial policy, and we're going to make some comparisons between those two documents. So my first request is that you open that federal fisheries regulation. All right, so again, the hyperlink is available on the last slide, and I want you to have a look at section 2. Within section 2, what we are doing is outlining some areas and activities that are actually not addressed by this regulation. So there are some exemptions and in which activities do have to follow this specific regulation. So I'll give you a few minutes and you can have a look and see your interpretation. So my suggestion is pause the video, go into those sections, and then you can come back to the video when you think you have your answer. So you should have had some time to get into the federal fisheries regulation for Ontario. And what I want you to be reviewing is the application for this specific regulation. So you'll notice in section 2 that it says that the regulation applies in Ontario, so it's very specific to our province, but it also indicates several activities where the regulation is not inclusive of. And so you'll see that subsection 2, it says the regulation does not apply to, and what I want you to do as you look at this section is think of the key areas or activities where this isn't applying. So what you should be noticing is it's talking about national parks. Notice that there are a few subsections that are looking at the activities surrounding aquaculture, and that we're looking at areas where we have created artificially created waters and that we are managing fisheries within there. So there's 3 key activities where this specific regulation isn't applying. And the reason that we have exempted these activities from the regulation, as a bit of background, is that there are actually other regulations that are helping to support management within these areas. So the next section that I would like you to go to is to have a look at section 4. And when you look at section 4, what I want you to notice is that this particular section is giving authority. So think back to the purposes of legislation and regulations and what we may be including in those policies. And as you have a look at section 4, I want you to keep that in the back of your mind, that this is giving authority. So my 2 questions are, what powers does section 4 of the regulation provide, and who is it giving those powers to? So again, pause the video, have a look at section 4, and then you can circle back and we can have a look at that together. So what I really want you to notice as you're looking at section 4 is pay attention to the subheadings within the regulation. And as you're looking at that regulation, you should be noticing the focus of this particular section. So notice that it's talking about licenses, and it's looking at the ability to provide some additional requirements or conditions within those licenses. I also want you to notice, and so there is a lot of detail included in here. So remember, the regulations is meant to give the details. So you will notice a lot of little components in here talking about exactly what we can be including as part of those terms and conditions within a license. So it could be types of fish, it could be how many fish, the weight of those fish, specific locations. But one of the questions in the assignment is also looking at who are we providing that power to. And so notice that first line within section 4. And I want you to be specific in that in your answer. So notice it is talking about a minister. And so I want you to use the interpretation section. So remember, interpretation section is providing some definitions, and be specific in which minister we are providing that authority to. So once you had an opportunity to look at that question, I want to move over for you to have a review of section 13. All right. And so when you're looking at section 13, I want you to be thinking about what 3 things does this section give us the ability to change in order to meet the specific provincial needs. So in one of the previous slides, we talked about part of the powers that we are giving is that we are providing some ability for each of the provinces to vary from the federal legislation and regulations. So as you reviewed that previous section, section 4, that is part of giving that authority, that through the regulation we are creating the structure which authorizes ministers, provincial ministers, to make those changes. Okay, so that helps to set the structure for the variation order. When we then move into section 13, what we're looking then at is what things can we be including as part of that variation. And so we're going to be using what we investigate here, the interpretation that you are making based on section 13, to then go into the Ontario summary document and look more specifically at in 2020, how has the provincial government made variations to what the federal fisheries regulation is looking at. So when you are providing your answers as part of this assignment question, please do not cut and paste the language from the regulation. I want you to really work hard on describing it in your own words. All right, so think that if you were explaining it back to me, rather than repeating the legal language that you're seeing in the regulation, see if you can change those words in order for them to be so plain language and descriptive of what the key components are. And so you're looking for 3 key things. So you should now be at section 13. And what I want you to do when you're looking at section 13 is to focus on that first line of subsection 1. So think that we are giving authority for the provincial minister to make some changes based on the local scenario within the province and their fish populations. And so when you're looking at that first sentence, and I'm going to leave the interpretation to you, is look at what 3 components we're giving authority to adjust and refine. To provide some background context, and we'll delve into this as we look at the provincial guidance document, I want you to think that each of the provinces, and for smaller jurisdictions within those provinces, we have different types of fish. We have different management needs within those different regions. And so the authority that is being provided here is allowing those local jurisdictions to adjust and refine their management needs based on the types of fish they may be having in order to address some local priorities. So in some scenarios, we may have an abundance of fish. And in other scenarios, we may have fish that are struggling, that have been overfished, or we have disease scenarios where we're trying to ensure that that population is rebounding. And so by providing this authority, it helps to support those local jurisdictions in some better management. So spend a few minutes and incorporate some of your own language in order to explain in plain language what those 3 components. As you proceed through the regulation, one thing that I want you to note is that language surrounding schedules starts to appear. And so let's circle back to the intent of a schedule. Okay, so schedules are used in legislation and regulations in order to provide a lot of information in a clear and concise way. And so when you're having a look at the schedules, so in section 15, it's talking about angling close times. So again, think about the interpretation of that. And it's referring to Schedule 2. So Schedule 2, when you proceed to that schedule, what you should be seeing is a listing of different close times related to certain species of fish. Okay, and so close times, if you're struggling with that interpretation, think that we're looking at times when we are not able to fish, and that by looking at that particular schedule, you're going to see a listing of different types of species and time frames. And so I have an example included here on the next slide. So as you are looking at Schedule 3, you can be noticing that we're talking about quotas, we're talking about sizes, and we're talking about the ability to keep some of those fish, depending on if you're doing sports fishing or so conservation fishing may be related to some of the management components that we're undertaking. So again, think about interpretation of schedules and how we're using schedules within legislation and regulations. That schedules give us the ability to include a whole lot of information in a clear and concise manner. And so it's presenting lists of information through a table. So I now want to move our attention to the provincial policy document. And so we're going to have a look at the 2020 Fishing Ontario Recreational Fishing Regulations Summary. So a very long title. But what I want you to note is the relationship between this document and the legislation and regulations that we just had a look at. So the image that you are seeing on this slide is a provincial policy. This particular document, the regulation summary document, is produced annually by the provincial ministry, and it is focused specifically on the recreational activities that would be happening related to fisheries management. So this is where that variation ability and the authority to look at tweaks and refinements that the provincial government needs to make based on local scenarios. This document is creating that refined framework. Okay, so think that the document is taking into consideration current knowledge and science within multiple jurisdictions, so that as we make some of those refinements, that we are basing it on current environmental need. So we are going to open up that regulation fisheries summary document. If you haven't already done that, you can go back in the lecture material and the PDF document is posted and available for you. So go back to lecture 5 and you can click on the hyperlink there and it's going to open up the PDF document for you. One thing that I want you to notice is that it's broken down into smaller jurisdictions. So you will see some general information at the beginning of the document that supports fishing, recreational fishing across all of Ontario, but then it goes into multiple zones. So there is a larger map at the beginning of the document that helps break the province into different fishing zones. Okay, and so I'm going to focus on some of those general requirements related to recreational fishing that addresses or covers the entire province. And then we'll get into some more specifics based on City of Barrie and the jurisdictions in which we may be fishing within our local limits. So I have a few questions posted on this slide that I'd like you to go in and have a look within this regulation summary document. So the first question is, look at the difference between catch limit and possession limit. And so think that as we are fishing, we are creating some specific requirements on number of fish that we are able to fish for and what we're doing once we've caught a fish. All right, so it does also include as part of those descriptions what we should be doing when we reach our catch and possession limit. I thought the third question here was timely, so think about we are seeing some melting happening out on Lake Simcoe, and so I want you to have a look at what date ice huts have to be removed from Lake Simcoe. And then the last question is, I want you to have a look at some specific exceptions surrounding Lake Simcoe. All right, and so this is starting to look at some variations that are happening based on that federal authority that is being given. And so I'll help you in the next couple of slides look at some of those considerations, but notice that Lake Simcoe has some very specific considerations. So if you can pause the video and have a look for those key terms, then we can work through some of them together in the video as well. So as you're thinking about these answers, I'll just help you navigate through the regulations document a little bit. One thing that I want you to notice is that on page 9, it gives that breakdown of zones within the province of Ontario. And so the way the summary document is created is that we recognize that it's not a cookie cutter approach within the province. One size doesn't fit all, and that we are segmenting the province into different areas based on different management needs. And so take notice of, so there's some mention of Lake Simcoe and City of Barrie within the assignment questions. And so take notice of the zone that we are included in as part of this document. And so what you're able to do once you're in the document is you can actually hyperlink to multiple sections or the zone in which you would be fishing in order to get some more specific guidance on the intent of the management activities and some restrictions around what you can and can't do as part of your recreational component. So notice the document also focuses on the licensing component. So in the federal regulation, we are giving powers to the provinces in order to have those licenses, and we are, as part of those powers, also giving them the ability to create certain terms and conditions. So if you are a recreational fisher, as part of your own responsibilities, you are required to obtain one of those licenses. And by obtaining one of those licenses, you are also agreeing to follow this particular summary document within any given year. So I'm just going to move over as part of this document, and so it starts on page 14. There is also some components where we're looking at some definitions. So there is a glossary term included in here. And so you can be using this glossary term to help you identify that distinction between catch and possession limit. And so again, what I want you to be thinking about here is as we are regulating these activities, we are being very specific with those who obtain those licenses on the number of fish that they are allowed to catch and what they should be doing once they meet that limit. Okay, so you can be reviewing in here the distinctions between a catch limit and a possession limit. Okay, and as part of the assignment questions, it's asking you to be thinking about in your own words, how you would be describing those different components. The next component that the questions that I want you to have a look at are considering ice fishing. All right, and so again, as part of the requirements through the licenses is we can address safety of those who are undertaking recreational fishing. And so this is one of those safety components. And so if you remember which zone Lake Simcoe was in, you can be having a look within this particular section and noting the date the ice fishing huts had to be removed from Lake Simcoe in order to address some of those safety considerations. So we're looking at certain times of year and when the lake may be starting to melt so we don't have that solid ice cover, and we can be enforcing some specific requirements on ensuring the removal of those specific structures. The last component that I wanted to show you is within the fishing zone that is applicable to Lake Simcoe. So you can see on the screen that there are multiple jurisdictions outlined here. And so again, we're refining within this document some of the local management requirements based on the needs of the fish population within those local jurisdictions. And we can be refining and providing some additional details. And so when you look at these details, what I want you to be thinking about is we can be layering on some different requirements or exceptions on how we may be fishing in each of these local jurisdictions. And so when you have a look, whether it's within Lake Simcoe or some other jurisdictions, we are talking about how many fish we can catch. Okay, so there's certain quotas that we may be looking at. We can be looking at size of fish. So you'll notice in some cases it's identifying that we're restricting the length of fish that we catch, and it also is incorporating different seasons of when we can be, or different dates in when we can be fishing. Okay, so adding some additional layers on refinements of what sorts of things can happen within some smaller level jurisdictions. So having gone through the summary document and showing you the mapping, I'm hoping that you are now able to answer the question on the next slide as well. So this is looking at, within that summary document, can you be identifying what fishing zone that the city of Barrie is located in? And so answering some of the previous questions should help you in answering this particular question. The last thing that I want to look at is looking at a comparison of the federal regulation and the schedules that you had an opportunity to look at, and comparing it to some of the variations that you may be seeing within the Ontario fishing document. Okay, so we are going to focus on that City of Barrie zone. And I want you to be able to compare and contrast the federal regulation and the provincial summary document. And so I'll just show you the components that I want you to have a look at here. So when you are in the federal regulation, we're going to be using Schedule 3. All right, so remember, the purpose of schedules is to list out a whole bunch of different information. We are going to go and use the zone that the city of Barrie is within. And so notice that, again, long list of information that is provided within schedules, and the purpose is that it is a clear and concise way of communicating those components. So the next question, what it's asking you to do is take this federal regulation and to compare it to some of the variations that are happening within the Ontario Fisheries Regulation document. Okay, so again, you're going to need to go use the mapping again in order to find the zone that the city of Barrie is within. Okay, so we can be looking at the mapping, and that we are going to be looking very specifically at some of the requirements and changes within this particular zone. So I'm going to ask that you provide me one example of where a variation has happened. Okay, so think about that term that the provinces have been given flexibility based on their local fish populations to adjust the federal regulation. So you are going to be comparing and contrasting the Ontario summary document to the federal regulation. One thing that I do want you to note is that if you are looking at close times within the federal document, that you are the language in the provincial summary is different. So summary guidance document is meant to be in plain language, and so what you will see here is it's actually giving you times when you can fish. Okay, so it's going to look at open times the season in which we can fish within the provincial summary document versus the language in the federal document is opposite, is times when we cannot fish. So make sure that as you're reviewing and looking for an example of an exception, that you're thinking about those components. So that example can be any component. We can be looking at when we can fish and does it differ from what the federal regulation indicated. It could be number of fish that we can catch, or it could be the size of the fish that we are allowed to catch, and that it is different than what is included in the federal regulation. Okay, so again, I just need one example. I'm going to include a few examples up on the slide, but in order to get the mark for this question, you need to give me a different example. All right, but this is the type of thing that I'm looking for, is that you are comparing and contrasting what the federal regulation says to what the current Ontario guidance document includes for recreational fishers. To support you in that interpretation, I'm just going to show you another example and give you a little bit of a tip. So when you're reviewing the Ontario summary document, where that document doesn't have a size limit, it means that there are no limits on the size of fish that is caught. Where there are size limits listed, it may be a variation from the federal document, or it may be relisting and providing that linkage back to what the federal requirements are. Okay, so again, this is linked back to that section 13 that we had a look at earlier and some of the authority that are provided to those provincial ministers as part of the variation order. So this ends the first video. Takeaway from this is I do want you to be able to describe the relationship that is happening between the federal and provincial policies. So think about the framework that the federal legislation and regulations are providing and what sorts of things that the provincial governments can do and how they are conveying that information through the recreational fishing regulations summary on an annual basis. Thanks for listening. I hope that helps you through the first set of lecture slides, and the second video will be looking at pollinator health in Ontario.